The place is Rostov-on-Don. Two men, waiting in a line for beer, get into an argument with each other. And what made it particularly interesting to the world is that they were arguing about this man's philosophy, Immanuel Kant. And what made that particularly interesting is that Kant would have been totally against what they were doing. So you wonder what's actually going on. We don't know that much more of the story beyond the fact that one of them pulled a gun and shot the other one full of rubber bullets. So for me, this is a particularly interesting news story that's, I would say, at the risk of becoming a meme that's going to be around on the internet for a while. I'm sure that somebody's already started to put together captions with pictures of Kant, and maybe these guys in beer or something along those lines. Why is it such an interesting story? Is it just sort of the famous for being famous kind of phenomenon? There's a lot of people posting about it. We don't actually know all that much about what took place because the news reports are basically just recycling the same bits of information, including the one really important bit of information, which is that we don't actually know what these guys were arguing about having to do with Kant. We don't even know if these guys understood Kant adequately, or if they were, zeroing in on one particular exegetical point in some treatise that they both knew quite well. But it is a really interesting story for me for 5 different reasons. One is that it became a story at all. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. Another is that these guys actually came to blows. So it went through a number of different stages over some interpretation of Immanuel Kant and his philosophy or the importance of it. Another thing that was kind of interesting that came out is this notion that it's common to argue and get heated about ideas in Russia, that's part of the culture, and that's worth reflecting on a little bit. The fourth thing is that clearly this is completely at antipodes from anything that Kant stood for, believed in, taught about. It goes contrary to so much in Kantian philosophy, and I'll talk a bit about that. And then the fifth thing is that Kant has some really interesting things to say, although not in great depth, not in deep analysis, about not just why this would be wrong, how it wouldn't fit the categorical imperative, but about the workings of the human soul with respect to the emotions and the passions and our duties to, in broad sense, get along with each other. And I think that's being left out in the discussions, so I want to try to reintroduce that. So, the first point, when I first saw this story a few days ago, I was like, well, that's kind of interesting that people actually got into an argument in Russia about Kant. And I figured, well, I've got all these philosophy colleagues. Somebody's going to be posting about it. I don't need to post about it. And it just sort of snowballed, and more people kept posting about it, making all sorts of funny jokes about it. But nobody seems to have contributed any sort of illumination of what exactly took place with these guys. We know about the sequence of events in very broad strokes. These guys were waiting in line to buy beer, apparently, at a grocery store in Rostov-on-Don, and got themselves into a discussion about Kant. We don't know whether they were friends or colleagues or maybe students together, or whether they just, were guys who happened to start chatting. And eventually the argument got heated, and they started punching each other, and then one of them whipped out a pistol, started shooting the other one. Thankfully it was rubber bullets, so didn't kill him, as could have been the case. And then he fled, and apparently has been apprehended and is getting in quite a bit of trouble. Now, how did something like this actually become a news story? That's interesting to reflect upon. It became a news story by cycling through social media, by becoming part of what, in some sense, is like the notion of the Republic of Letters that was so popular in Enlightenment times that Kant himself was a part of. And, I mean, this is something that's really worth spending a lot of time discussing, and I'm not going to have the time to go into it here. But there's this notion that, we often talk about the marketplace of ideas, and in some respects social media is like that, but marketplaces are where you carry out a lot of private transactions, and there's not a lot of community being built or meaning being created. In the Enlightenment, they had this conception of a republic of letters with sort of the educated populace, the literate thinking populace that they saw as growing and growing and growing. And in some respects, historically, it really was. Becoming closer and closer, not only in mindset and in their opinions, but even in sentiment, in habits, in appreciation. It was a very humanistic idea. And there's a lot of things really, wrong with or problematic about social media, but one thing that is interesting about it is it does allow for communication of ideas. And in this case, it's about these two guys, duking it out over Immanuel Kant in some southern Russian city, which is quite interesting. So the very fact that this actually becomes a news story is, I think, significant and worthy of remarking upon. Now, these guys come to blows over a bit of philosophy. And I think, some of what people are reacting to in this is the idea that somehow philosophers should be above that sort of thing. Now, if you spend any time with philosophers, academic, professional philosophers, you'll realize that that's probably true in large respect, that they're not going to get in fistfights very often. But that's because most philosophers, at least these days, are pretty sedentary types and tend to be, at least in my experience, kind of timid when it comes to actually resorting to physical force. That's probably enough to say about that. I would say that quite a few of them are not, the bravest people around. There are quite a few of them that have, serious anger problems and would like to get in fights with people. And there are quite a few of them who, for one reason or another, do really engage in a lot of martial arts or physical things, and you probably wouldn't want to mess with those people, particularly if they're into like Nietzsche or de Sade or Bataille or somebody who countenances violence, George Sorrell, But for the most part, philosophers, at least these days, aren't into that sort of thing. Most academics aren't, I think. But these guys weren't philosophers. There's nothing about this story that should suggest that these two guys were even students of philosophy, let alone professional philosophers. And let's even say that they were philosophers. Does that mean that they won't get into fistfights? No, not at all. If you look through history, it's funny. You should read some of the discussions about philosophers, particularly. Now, this is sort of going over the top, but particularly in Lucian of Samosata, who is this satirist, who has quite a few cases where philosophers actually, they go to the same dinner party and they get into a fight, and they're throwing dishes at each other, or food at each other, punching each other. So, I mean, that sort of thing did happen. Usually you'd expect it to be a bit more dignified. But here's the thing. Put all that aside. These guys weren't philosophers. Is there anything about being interested in ideas and being interested in particular in philosophy that is necessarily going to make a person more tame, more patient, less likely to get into fist fights or to pull a gun and shoot rubber bullets at somebody? No. As a matter of fact, Aristotle, Epictetus, plenty of other people, but those two I'm just thinking of in particular because I remember reading passages of them recently where they were actually talking about those who study philosophy but don't do a darn thing with it. It doesn't make any change on their characters because they're basically interested in learning the philosophy as a kind of, really an academic kind of game or something that they can be proud of in relation to other people. Hey, I've learned Chrysippus, Epictetus says. He says, that doesn't do you a damn bit of good if you can't actually apply the stuff and live a better life. Aristotle says something quite similar, and I think really anybody could say that sort of thing. There's nothing intrinsically, there's nothing intrinsic about the actual texts themselves, assuming you even study them and crack them open and think about it, that's going to automatically transform a person into a more patient, less violent, less angry type of being. So I think that there is an assumption there, though, that we have. A lot of people have this. I think that's what's part of behind Aristotle's talk about this. Hey, those people read these, books of academic philosophy, and they think it's making them a better person, but it's not making them a better person. Why do we have that notion? Well, I don't know. That's something else that I'd say is worth exploring as well. Just having nice thoughts, just surrounding ourselves with books or talking about ideas doesn't change our moral character by itself, and may not even have any influence on it. It actually could make us worse because oftentimes we think that we're better off than we are when it comes to our character and our moral capacities. And if we talk about it enough, we psych ourselves into thinking that we're better people. So that's kind of an interesting point too. So that's the second point. Third point is I find it fascinating that, and also understandable, that these news people are sort of reporting offhandedly that Russians like to argue about ideas. One of the common complaints that's made about Americans, of course, is that we're anti-intellectual, that we're just, interested in popular culture or commerce or keeping up with the neighbors or, things like that we don't talk about the big ideas. And I don't really think that's true. I think that, you travel around the world, you find a lot of people concerned with day-to-day occupations or with prestige products and chasing after power or popularity or things like that. And then you find a lot of other people that are interested in ideas. And so there is something like a republic of letters that we can participate in. I'm willing to believe, until I learn otherwise, that maybe Russians are a bit more interested in talking about ideas, and that's based solely on sort of anecdotal evidence coming from reading a lot of Russian literature, which is probably fairly unrepresentative, and on the other hand, thinking about Russians who I've met, and other Eastern Europeans who I've met, who tended to be pretty interested in ideas, and manage also at the same time to be quite, impractical people when it came to those working with those ideas. There is something kind of good about thinking, having this picture of people standing in a line, about to buy beer, wanting to talk about Kant, or pick anybody else, wanting to talk about Hume, wanting to talk about Cicero, wanting to talk about Thomas Aquinas, wanting to talk about all sorts of great thinkers throughout history, wanting to talk about literature, wanting to talk about history, not just wanting to talk about the debt crisis or the cost of meat or who's winning an American Idol or things like that. I kind of like that idea. So I'm not really sure what to do with that, but that's the third point. Now let's talk about Kant himself and how much what these guys were doing was completely at antipodes from what Kant actually stands for. And there I think it's worth talking about the categorical imperative, which a lot of people have brought up, but I think it's worth kind of working our way through it. This kind of like what you would call a teachable moment. It's a time where we can actually see, what did this Kant guy think and stand for? What did he contribute to our understanding of morality? And by the way, I'm not myself a Kantian. I just happen to think that he's got some interesting ideas. And if these guys themselves were Kantians, they may not have been. They may have been arguing about how totally wrong Kant was, and one guy said, no, he's wrong for this reason, the other guy said he's wrong for this reason. But let's just assume that they actually thought that Kant was on the right track. Well, then we want to look at this notion of the categorical imperative. So the first version of the categorical imperative, like I put here, is act only on the maxim you can at the same time will to be a universal law of nature. And this is typically called the Universalization Formula because you are talking about whether you can say something ought to hold for everybody. And the way Kant understands this is you ought to try to imagine a world in which everybody is going to behave according to that rule. And would it be logically consistent, or would there be logical contradictions or inconsistencies that would come up? That would mean that you shouldn't act that way. Then you can also ask, can you will it? Even if it's logically coherent, would you be able to consistently will a world like that? Would it make sense to do that? So that is the first formulation of Kant's categorical imperative, which is one of his, real major contributions to morality. Now, the second formulation, which is often called the humanity formulation, is act always so as to treat humanity in oneself and in others, never merely as a means alone, but always as an end in itself. And this one is a little bit harder to get through the terminology at first, but is a lot easier to apply. It's saying don't use other people. Don't treat them merely as objects to satisfy one's own desires, inclinations, propensities, interests. Treat them as if they actually possess an inherent dignity, a worth that places them on the same level as oneself, to treat them as a human being. It also says you're supposed to do this with yourself as well, but that gets a little bit more complicated, and it's really not that important, I think, for this particular example. So one of the things that I've noticed when people talk about the categorical imperative, they throw it around a lot. And these two formulations that we've just looked at, they apply to this situation as they would, any situation if you're trying to make sense of this in a Kantian manner. But what they require you to do is actually formulate maxims. You've got to say what the general rule that's sort of being examined, being tested, being critiqued, being criticized actually is. And when you're asking about that, you're asking about not just what did the person do, why did they do it? What was their purpose? How did they conceptualize what they were doing? How would they explain it to another person? And again, we have to be a little bit careful with this case because we don't have the capacity to peer inside the heads of these two bruisers who got into the fight. But I think we can we can say, look, if they're fairly rational people, they weren't just like fighting with the demons in their heads or something like that. They probably ran through some sort of lines of reasoning, sort of like this. So let's think about each one of these in turn, and then see what we would do in terms of the formulations of the categorical imperative, the ones that we've looked at so far. So, when I find myself in disagreement with another person, I will argue my case to them. Makes sense. I think that's reasonable enough, and that's what we do when we actually disagree about things. Sometimes we don't even go that far. Sometimes we say, well, let's agree to disagree, or I'm not going to talk about it because, better not get into an argument about this sort of thing and get heated. Maybe it's not the right time. But if it's okay, if there isn't any other thing standing in the way, duty-wise, as far as Kant would say, this is probably good enough. And then, how did it escalate? Well, maybe some of these other maxims were involved. When I believe a person I am arguing with is wrong, I will become angry with that person. That's an interesting way to think about this. Usually when we're talking about Kant, nobody wants to bring up the emotions at all, other than otherwise, to say, just don't follow any emotions, don't get emotional, right? But these guys seem to think that it was okay to get angry. Can we look at that from a Kantian perspective? When I become angry with an interlocutor in argument, I will resort to force. And we could ask why. Why did these guys start, boxing with each other or fighting with each other? Was it just because of the anger? Did they see this as a way to persuade the other person, hey, I'm right, I'm going to impose this interpretation of Kant or against Kant or whatever it was that they were arguing about on the other person? And then finally, when I'm involved in an argument that turns violent, I will use greater, though not deadly, because he used rubber bullets, force. Each one of these would be a maxim that if you were to look inside of the structure of motivation and choice and action on the part of these two guys, or at least, the last one of these guys, you could say that's what they were up to. So let's think about this. When I find myself in disagreement with another person, I will argue my case to them. Can you make that a universal law of nature? Can you say everybody, when they are in a situation where they find themselves in disagreement with another person, they will argue the case for what it is that they think is the right thing? Yeah, I think you can make that a universal law of nature. I think you can even will that. It makes sense to. That's a rational way of trying to resolve differences and to convince people that we think are actually off base. That makes good sense. We could also go a little bit further with it and say, when I find myself in disagreement with another person, I will argue my case to them, and I will listen as objectively as possible to their case. Totally universalizable, right? You can say, yeah, that's the way the world should work. It'd be a much better world if people did do that. There's nothing logically incoherent about saying that. You can will it. It makes good sense. Another thing to think about with that is you're also treating the other person as, the humanity in the other person as an end. If you're trying to rationally convince another person, you're trying to give them evidence or trying to give them reasons to accept your point of view. And if you're willing to listen to them and be open to being convinced of their point of view, you're completely treating them as an end. You're treating them with human dignity. You're not simply reducing them to a means. So far so good. What about the second one? When I believe a person I am arguing with is wrong, I will become angry with that person. Can you universalize that? Can you imagine a world in which every time that somebody gets angry with another person, or every time that a person disagrees with another person, they have to become angry with that person? There's nothing logically incoherent or contradictory about such a world. You can imagine such a world. Would it make sense to will such a world? No. So it actually fails the first formulation of the categorical imperative, not because it can't be universalized, but because it wouldn't make sense to will that kind of world. So what that reveals to us is that we actually have an imperfect duty, a broad duty, not to get angry with people with whom we're engaged in argument or disagreement. Likewise, we can say, well, they have a similar duty with respect to us, not to get angry at us. Let's move to the second formulation. Are you treating a person as a means and not an end if you become angry with that person? It really depends on the grounds of the anger, doesn't it? If you're getting angry with the person simply because they're contradicting you, or because you don't like being wrong, yes, then I think actually by allowing yourself to become angry with them, especially if you're acting on the anger, you are treating them as a means to the satisfaction of your desires, your inclinations, one of which is to wanting to be right. If you're angry with the other person because it really bothers you that they are stuck in being wrong, and you know that they're wrong, or at least you feel you know that they're wrong, one might say in a case like that you are respecting the other person, but you really have to be careful from a Kantian perspective. You know, there's a difference between knowing that the other person is wrong and that it's bad for them to be wrong about this sort of thing, and thinking that to be the case, feeling that to be the case, but not actually knowing that to be the case. We're often paternalistic with each other. We want to remove the obstacles, the stumbling blocks to other people's understanding. But sometimes when we do that, we don't actually know what we're talking about. So you got to be a little bit careful with that. You could be treating the other person as merely a means to your vision of the way things ought to be. Let's move on to the next. When I become angry with an interlocutor in an argument, I will resort to force. Can you universalize this? I would say no. And just off the cuff, the reason I would say no is if you're engaged in argument, once you leave argument behind and decide to resort to force in order to make your points, you're going against the whole purpose of argument, which is to produce rational conviction in another human being. So there is some sort of logical incoherence at least, or performative contradiction in what you're doing. You could actually leave the become angry part out of that. What if we focus on the becoming angry? Because I'm angry, I will use force against another person. That you really can't universalize either. I mean, now, here's where I would actually probably differ from Kant. For Kant, it's not supposed to be about the consequences. It's supposed to be just about the action itself and whether it's sort of logically coherent. For me, it doesn't make sense to say we ought to all follow what anger wants from us, because anger is by its own nature, here's an Aristotelian point, if not irrational, completely irrational, at least it doesn't listen to reason as it should, to the degree that it should. Aristotle calls it like a hasty servant who listens to half the instructions and then runs off and then botches the job. So I don't think we would universalize that. Certainly we could, once we get to the point of can we will it? No, you cannot will that every time a person gets angry they should resort to force. Let's think about the humanity formula now. You become angry with somebody, you're going to resort to force to convince them, or just to indulge your anger, to vent it upon them. You are treating that person as just a means to an end then, an end that has to do with your own satisfaction. Whether you're just venting and attacking them because you want to feel what anger is pushing you towards, the satisfaction of imposing something on them, or you want to try to convince them, but you're doing it just out of anger, you are treating them as just a mean, not as an end valuable in itself. Because if you did treat them as an end valuable in itself, you wouldn't punch them in the nose, right? What about the last one? When I'm involved in an argument that turns violent, so two people are using force against each other, I will use greater, though not deadly force. So there's some restraint there. Can you universalize this? No, you can't universalize that. I'm going to escalate the level of force. Force is already being used. Force ought to be used in measured amounts. Force ought to be used basically to resolve situations, not to make them worse, somebody like Kant would say. For me to decide, it's not like I'm a police officer measuring out the amount of force, thinking this is actually going to serve, the larger society. I'm acting as a private citizen. I'm not being threatened with deadly force myself. I'm escalating the level of force. No, that can't be universalized. Even if it could, and I don't think it can, there's no way you would will that. So when you're doing that, what about the humanity formula, the second formulation of the categorical imperative? I think in that case, too, you are actually treating that person as a means to an end. Whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, a resolution of the situation, your own safety, by raising the level of force when they haven't actually threatened deadly force, you're treating them as a mere means to an end. So that's what's going on in this situation. That's how I think Kant would actually look at all of this. The fifth thing that I want to talk about that gets brought up, at least for me, by this little fracas in Rostov-on-Don over Kantian philosophy, perhaps fueled by beer, we don't really know, is that Kant has other really interesting things to say about this sort of thing. And it doesn't have to do so much with the categorical imperative as such, and more to do with other conceptions having to do with duty, with what we call broad or imperfect duties, and with the emotions and the passions and the ways those sort of things work. Now, Kant wrote this book, The Groundwork, that the categorical imperative is coming, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. And usually people sort of stop short there in their study of Kant. And that was also supposed to be tied in with the second critique, which, again, unless you're a philosopher, perhaps a political theorist, or there's a few other fields, you probably don't read that. It's worth reading the actual metaphysics of morals, because Kant says a lot of really interesting connect the dots kind of stuff in that work. And he also says things about these sorts of topics in another work called Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View. Now, Kant was all about reason is over here, and reason ought to determine, how we should behave, and the passions, the emotions, the sentiments, all the affective things are over here, except for moral feeling. That's kind of a weird thing that we could talk about some other time. And then the will is right there, smack dab in the middle. And the will can go this way, or the will can go this way. If it goes this way, even if it does the right thing, it's doing it for the wrong reasons. And so its actions, its choices are without moral value. It's only when the will wills rationally, objectively, universally, the categorical imperative fits in with that. Doing duty for its own sake, that you have moral value in what the will is determining and what the person is choosing to do and what they in fact do. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no value whatsoever in emotion, but in general, emotion and passion is going to be a problem for Kant. And there's certain determinate ways in which this works itself out. So let's actually look at a few things. I picked out a few interesting portions where he talks about this sort of stuff. The first thing I want to hit on is this notion of a broad or relaxed or imperfect duty. A lot of times people will frame perfect duties versus imperfect duties as, well, perfect duties are the ones you have to do, and imperfect duties are the ones that you don't have to do, but you're a better person if you do them. It's better to do them than to not do them, but you're not required to do them, so it's up to you. Kant talks that way sometimes, but really when it comes down to it, the way that he sees it is, no, you do have a duty to do the imperfect duties. It's just that the perfect duties supersede them. He says, by a broad duty is not understood a permission to make exceptions to the maxim of the actions, but only the permission to limit one's maxim of duty by another. So, for example, the general love of one's neighbor, which is an imperfect duty, by the love of one's parents, which you have a stronger duty towards. He says, the broader the duty, the more imperfect, therefore, in what is one's obligation to an action. Now, what makes us good people is being virtuous, and being virtuous means being the kind of person who actually does those imperfect duties and chooses to do them, even when we don't have to. It's sort of reflective in our choices over time, you can say. He says, the strength of purpose in such fulfillment is alone properly called virtue. Deliberate transgression, on the other hand, that has become a principle properly constitutes what's called vice. So, if we want to think about, are these guys vicious? Now, again, we don't know that much about it, so we're going to have to proceed kind of hypothetically. But, we can say certain things based on what Kant says about emotions and passions. So here's what he says about those. Emotions and passions are essentially distinct. Emotions belong to feeling, which preceding reflection as it does makes reflection more difficult or even impossible. So, you feel excited, you're having a harder time concentrating on things, you feel surprised, for a moment you can't actually think about things, you feel sad, that makes it difficult for you to think about non-sad things and attend to other details of the situation and think things out. You feel desirous of something, that can get in the way, you feel angry. Those are sort of momentary things that pop up in his view. So he says, emotion is therefore called hasty or precipitate, and reason declares through the concept of virtue that a man should collect himself. So to be virtuous, for Kant, means to try not to be affected by these emotions, or when you do get affected by them, don't let them run the show. Don't let them, change how you ought to think about things. So he says, nevertheless, this weakness is the use of one's understanding, joined with the strength of the agitation, is only a lack of virtue, and as it were something weak and childish. It can be consistent with the best will, and moreover has one good point, that its storm soon subsides. So a propensity towards emotion, for example anger, is therefore not so closely related to vice as passion is. So here we're going to have a big distinction. Passion, he says, is the sensible appetite grown into a lasting inclination. For example, hatred, as in contrast to anger. He says the calmness with which one indulges passions permits reflection and allows the mind to frame principles for it. Now, I don't think we can take that as applying to all passion whatsoever. The basic point is that passion is where something has become habitual, it's become part of our character, it forms part of the manifold of what he calls inclinations, and it can provoke desires that continue on. So what are these guys involved in? It's difficult to say what exactly their emotional basis is because we don't know much about them. But let's just assume that they were angry, and maybe that anger, rose to the level that it did because it wasn't just something that pops up once in a while for these guys, but these guys are actually prone to anger and prone to getting into fights and big disagreements and stuff like that. So Kant talks about malice and making fun of people, and he calls this mockery. Light-minded fault-finding, the propensity to expose other people to ridicule or derision involved in making another person's faults. The immediate object of one's amusement is spite, he says. It's entirely different from joking or making fun of apparent faults while in the intimacy of one's friends. Why? Well, because you're like trying to hurt the other person. You're trying to get at them. And Kant seems to think that this can become, very, very ingrained in a person. He also talks about, and this is towards the end of the elements of ethics, what he calls the social virtues, or the the ones that we need in social, what do you call social intercourse, when we're discussing things with other people. And, what does this boil down to? Well, being polite with other people. Sometimes that means like letting the other person think that they won the argument even though they didn't make very good points. That's probably something that could have been useful in this altercation that took place. Kant talks about it this way. He says, it's one's duty both to himself and to others to use his moral perfection in social intercourse and not isolate himself. To be sure, a person must make himself the immovable center of his principles, but nevertheless he must regard his sphere as part of an all-encompassing sphere of cosmopolitan sentiment, not so much in order to promote the good of the world as to cultivate, this is really interesting, cultivate the means that lead indirectly to it, namely the agreeableness of society, sociability, mutual love and respect, affability and propriety. And so the graces will accompany virtue. It is even a duty, he says, to bring this about. So these guys failed in a broad number of duties. When they started getting angry, they had a duty to collect themselves and not allow the natural tendencies that we have to lead them into getting more and more heated and perhaps trading insults, making fun of each other. Who knows exactly what went on? Kant sees this sort of thing. It did get quite dangerous. One guy shot at another guy. Thankfully, it was rubber bullets, but he didn't kill him. But Kant would say, these little things, they actually matter. They are important. The way in which we deal with our emotions and our passions is very important. In the Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, there's a great passage here. He says, passions are cancerous stores for pure practical reason. Most of them are incurable because the sick person does not want to be cured and avoids the dominion of the principle by which alone a cure could be effected. When somebody actually is vicious, it's tough for them to admit that, and they'll try to rationalize the way in which they behave in all sorts of manners. And even when they say, yeah, I've got a problem, oftentimes they don't want to put in the work to change that. Kant would say that we have an obligation to do that. So, if I'm going to bring this to a close, you could ask, what does all this mean, right? You're a philosopher. Give me something that I can take home as a lesson about this. Well, I would say that this is a great time to remind ourselves that when we're engaged in discussion about ideas that matter, we should realize that if these really are ideas that matter, we're not going to begin from a point of agreement with most people. And we should be really happy when we find ourselves in agreement. And when we find ourselves in disagreement, we should try not to take it personally. We should watch out for our emotions getting engaged, or even worse, our vices, are what Kant calls passions, getting engaged, the ones that bear on emotion. I'm more Aristotelian than Kantian in this respect, but that's a total aside. And we should try to, still look at the other person as having some value, even if we think they're totally dead wrong. There's certain things that we shouldn't do, and those don't just include not punching them in the face or pulling a gun on them and shooting them up, but even talking to them in certain ways. So, and this is a lesson that it's taken me a long time to learn, and I didn't learn it from Kant. I learned it from the School of Hard Knocks and reflection and remorse and thinking about people like Epictetus and Aristotle rather than Kant. But I think Kant could teach us that lesson too, and I think that's what we ought to take from this whole episode.